Have you used assessments, but your team is not actually applying all of that knowledge? We want to talk about that today. Welcome back to the Help for Leaders podcast. I'm Stacey Harris. Before we jump into today's episode, click here to subscribe, hit that thumbs up, and ring that bell. I've got Juan Kingsbury with Career Blindspot joining me for today's episode. And Juan just wrote a book. Way to go, Juan.
Thank you.
Really excited about his book that's out. So we're going to talk about that and kind of the passion that really sparked this book and why it happened. And it's also a passion of mine. And it's all about when clients go through our assessments, invest in actually doing the training, doing the work, but then it just falls through the cracks. Mm-hmm. No one does anything. They don't apply all of this knowledge. So, Juan, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about why you wrote A New Work Mindset.
Yeah, so Juan Kingsbury, Career Blindspot, using same tools as Stacey, DISC, motivators, or driving forces, and the EQ. In the book is referenced of DISC and motivators. The reason I wrote the book is because in doing these workshops and doing one-on-one debriefs, team building, benchmarks for the purpose of hiring the ideal fit, I just kept noticing reoccurring blind spots or reoccurring missed opportunities with, it's like you have this great tool set, but you're like, oh, now there's a hole in my roof. Well, that's what those tools are for. It wasn't just buying it, so you have it. And if they're shiny and new, maybe you could be using them some more. And so a lot of people have written books about leadership, team, and I don't claim to be an expert on those things, although I work in that arena. I do pride myself on being a team facilitator and somewhat of a coach at times. But what I do know is jobs and people, and like any relationship, they evolve, they sometimes go sour, and I have a lot of conversations. I have a tendency to ramble, but I was like, there's these familiar themes in the book. And the book is very short. It's for the high D. No, it's because as much as I wanted to say everything, I was like, here's what I want to say in these 5 chapters, which is basically the thought of, we all want other people to do a great job, but we don't always do our best effort, but we don't ever question ourselves because we have good reasons why that is. And so realizing like this misfit of why can't people do their jobs, I do use some fun language from time to time to hit the point, because the truth is when we are upset in workplace, there's emotions behind it. And what I realize is, well, leaders set the example. People, kind of like kids to parents, sometimes can only you can only lecture so much, and assuming they're going to get it. But if you're not modeling the behavior, the odds go down. And then what I realize is that there's blind spots. There's tons of blind spots, but usually the biggest blind spot, which has a lot to do with the assessments. And if you're listening to this, you're a smart person, you're intelligent, you clearly care about people because you've opted into Stacey's content and trainings. And what everywhere always goes off is we start to forget our talent. Earlier, you were sharing a story at a different point in time about you questioning how a workshop went. Well, you weren't really clear on like why you're awesome and how you pivoted and all these other things that eventually you realize, oh, that's what made this great moment. So the first blind spot in the workplace is usually people lose sight of who they want to be, not necessarily who they are in the moment. And then lastly, it's I call it getting more fist bumps, which is basically how do you find opportunities where you get to be your style. So clearly I'm rambling a lot already, but I was like, how do I distill this so I can share this? Mm-hmm. So people, whether they've seen DISC before or they haven't, that's not the point. They're tools. But how do you have the full title being A New Work Mindset? It's a constant practice. It's not a one and done. Yeah. But the truth about leaders, jobs, and ourselves at work. And I really, in hindsight, I was like, I wish I had put my truth because my truth isn't the reality for everyone. But those 3 things, the people in charge, the roles we're asked to do, and how honest we are being with ourselves, those are the main variables that are fluctuating. So it's kind of a 3-year ordeal, probably only like about 4 months of actual work, but that's why I wrote my book.
Yeah, it's great. I'm really excited to dive in. I just got it hot off the press, so it is a quick read. So I will be diving into this because it is such a great information about how to apply what we're doing. And so I love it. And I love that we partner together so much in training and application of helping people to figure out the role, help them figure out themselves, how to be the best version of themselves, how to show up every day at work and make it work, because we spend a lot of time with those people, right? I mean, we spend a ton of time with our teams, and if we're not happy.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. Your job exists because there's problems every day. Those alone are problematic, but if you like solving those problems and you're able to do it your way on your agency, it's awesome. But if there's a misalignment there, now you have all these extra problems, and you're going to be more spending time managing stuff as opposed to leading initiatives. And we were talking with the trainings that I was like, how do I keep Stacy happy that she invites me back and trusts me to work with other people? But also the person asking you to do a training that you will ask me to fill in, there's the leader. Their version of what a good workshop is really is contingent on what are their disc and driving forces. How aware are they out? But like, if someone has a sky high resourceful driving force and a sky high or very intense instinctive, they don't want all the history and bells and whistles. They might find it interesting, but it's probably like, hey, we need to do this to have a good ROI so our team can come in and crush our numbers or cut down on costs. So me knowing what the leader wants totally paints how everyone's jobs are, and then also using the assessments, the truth about those individuals. Let's say someone's a high I, but they're in a very low I job. Oh, they're probably like, this job isn't innovative and this and that. Well, the truth is, you want innovation. The job requires redundancy or repetitiveness. You might see it as a negative, but that's all I'm doing over and over again. And so with these workshops, like teaching DISC and really DISC itself, but DISC and motivators and now EQ are the foundation. And I don't think I mentioned EQ at all in the book, but in hindsight, I was like, this is just EQ I'm teaching, a new work mindset. Because have you ever had bosses who they're doing great, but their team isn't? Someone with good EQ doesn't point the finger, but is objective. Yeah. But if you have a boss with a negative mindset, or you have a boss, less manager, and a great group of people, well, that's probably not going to last too long. Right. And so I was like, oh, I'm just talking about EQ. EQ is really just the outcome of how aware you are of your behavioral style, DISC, your motivational preference or driving forces, and how, like, are you actually winning? Are you sticking the landing? Or are you putting a lot of energy to things you can't really change? Yeah.
And I would say right now, in this climate of COVID and the pandemic and so many uncertainties still, I mean, I've got a lot of clients that are still all remote, work from home. I've got some that are, hybrids, some that are actually have been back in person for a while. So we have this gamut of what the job actually looks like, but things are changing constantly. And I'd say in this climate of change and so much transition over the last year and a half, our assessments are even more important 100%. Today than they were 2 years ago. Yes. And if you haven't taken an assessment in the last 2 years, you need to reassess, because it's a different climate that we're working in and living in.
Yeah, significant emotional events, marriage, divorce, death, becoming a parent, death in the family, a pandemic, and even if you have the exact same job that you had a year ago, but if it's at home, well, now it's not the same, because now when the dog barks or the neighbor mows their lawn, that affects you when you're recording your podcast or on the meeting. Or if you're still in the office and you're like, nothing has changed for me, and whatever, regardless of your beliefs. Well, if you're not acknowledging that lives have been turned upside down for everyone else, well, then you're living under a rock. And I'm not trying to point a finger. I'm like, you can use the information. And I'm a fan. You said 2 years. I would take it every 6 months. Wow. But clearly I'm biased. Wow. But here's why. Is because our jobs change a lot more than we realize. If you, somewhat of a controversial thing, but I won't be too specific. If you worked at the White House now and you had job ABC, but 8 years ago, 2 or 3 presidents, even though the job's exactly the same, the culture is different. Right. And so when you have a new boss, especially look at startups and stuff changes, or you inherit roles, or someone gets let go and you have to take their responsibility, or now you're the boss and you're responsible, but now you're more delegating, not doing. That shifts your job. Earlier I said, if you're the star of the basketball team, But becoming the coach, same arena, same sport, totally different for you and your expectations, your homework, your practice. So change, it's just more obvious now. And especially because of technology, it's going to keep happening. But it's always happened. And to go back to EQ, those people, you don't need to take an assessment. Just like you don't need sales training to be great at sales. Some people just kind of have that. But it's telling your truth about the environment around you and how you feel about it. It's not optional if you want fulfillment. I'll slightly disagree with you. You don't have to have a good mindset. You don't have to have EQ. But if you want to be happy and fulfilled at work, I think it's never been an optional thing. But now more people have higher expectations of what work can be, as opposed to just a paycheck and benefits.
Yeah, and I think that's why we're also seeing this huge transition in the workforce. As far as, what are they saying, 40% of the workforce has left the job, and they haven't re-engaged. And I think that is because it's like, everything's shifting, and I have this moment in time right now to make a change. And what is important to me? What's important? What do I value? And how am I going to pivot and fit that into my life? And so
I have a anecdote, not COVID related, but to me, it's great resignation, and I have opinions on that, or theories, I should say, but I don't know. I'm not an economist, but this really successful philanthropist that I've done work for, big fan of the assessments, and one day he's like, but one time I hired someone just like me, and it didn't work out, meaning the DISC style, the motivators, etc. And I was like, and I love being challenged. To me, if you just shake your head in agreements, that's great. But when you disagree, you're really going to learn. When you look at the blind spot, you're a way better driver. Or I should say, when you acknowledge it's there. So I was like, oh, I hadn't got that one yet. And then finally it hit me. I was like, oh, who do you work for? So he built his company, runs it, or was at the time, and kept bringing in people that weren't doing what he says to run his company. And I was like, oh, he's looking for a carbon copy clone. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but there's a reason he built his own company versus work for someone else. He was hiring someone a little too close to home. Doesn't mean hire your evil twin opposite, but behaviorally, motivationally, maybe more of an altruistic approach or more steadiness would have been more receptive to being the number 2 or 1A versus the main number 1. And so that's the thing, like our jobs are always changing. I think I've said this to you a couple of times now, but those of you who are parents, I'm hoping to be, but when you first hold baby, job description, magically floats over your head. But now they're 2, first description is don't drop them, feed them, change them. Then at 2, a little different, baby proof everything. 13, a little different. 25, and even if they're 55, you're still a parent. That job description change. Our jobs are changing all the time. We as people are changing a lot, but wherever your job is constantly influenced. So you don't have to take the assessment. But going back to the book, I was just like, oh, this mindset is in constant flux. Yeah. And if you're someone who cares, and I use the word leader with like a capital L, you are not pointing your fingers, you're looking for opportunities. And what I'm hoping happens is you realize what that is, because sometimes we got knocked on our rears and it's really hard to get back up. Yeah. Well, that's how other people who have negative feelings towards work feel. You can say they're lazy and make excuses or say they're entitled, or you can look at them from a different perspective and try to help them. Not everyone wants to be helped, but if you're a leader with a capital L, I believe you check your mindset first, and you're a lot more compassionate to other people's mindset. Yeah. So that's my hope with my short, a little pithy book that I wrote.
I love it. I mean, you said a couple of things. We learn and grow when we acknowledge those blind spots, when we lean into conflict, when we're not afraid to disagree and to push back. That's where growth happens. And then being flexible, because things are constantly changing. And so I think those are some real key takeaways from this conversation. So thanks so much for being a part of the Help for Leaders podcast. So join me next week. We'll be sharing more Help for Leaders. If you enjoyed this episode and would like more information on emotional intelligence, behavioral styles, or communication, I'd love for you to click here to watch more episodes. And we'd also love for you to click here to subscribe so you're notified each week when we post more content